Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Tonight we're going to talk about the not so pretty aspects of what daily life was like in ancient Rome. To the food, the Roman baths, elite Roman parties, and hygiene. We're going to cover it all. If you enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place and let's get started. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome. Marble temples rise overhead. The scent of fresh bread mingles with the smoke of street-side food stalls, and vendors shout to sell their wares. It all sounds like a glamorous scene, straight from a sword and sandal epic, until reality hits. The cobblestones under your feet aren't just slick from rain. They're slick from everything people and animals have dumped there. There's no plumbing in most homes, so chamber pots get emptied right out the window. Public toilets. There are a row of stone seats with no privacy and one communal sponge on a stick that everyone has to share. Bathhouses were a social hotspot, but the water wasn't exactly crystal clear, and you might be sharing it with more than just your friends. Parasites, skin infections, and all sorts of uninvited microscopic guests thrived there. Even dinner could be a mixed bag. Exotic delicacies like dormice or fermented fish sauce sat alongside questionable meat that had been sitting out in the Mediterranean sun far too long. The truth is, daily life in ancient Rome was equal parts impressive and pretty disgusting. The city was a marvel of engineering and culture, but it was also noisy, smelly, and crawling with hazards that would make any modern germaphobe break out in hives. So grab your toga and prepare yourself. We're diving headfirst into the grime, stench, and weird little habits that made up the everyday reality of Rome's so-called Golden Age. If you ever stepped foot in ancient Rome, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the grand temples or the bustling markets. It would be the smell. The city's odor was a living, breathing entity that followed you quite literally everywhere. Rome had over 1 million inhabitants at its peak, and while the Cloaca Maxima, the massive sewer system, was a marvel of engineering, it was far from perfect. Many neighborhoods weren't even connected to it, so waste disposal was a DIY affair. Households without proper plumbing emptied their chamber pots right into the street. If you were unlucky enough to be walking by, you might get a splash, which is why Roman law technically forbade dumping waste out of windows during daylight hours. And of course, technically doesn't mean people necessarily followed it. Add to that the animal factor. Donkeys, horses, and oxen hauled carts all day, leaving fresh droppings behind them. Dogs roamed freely, and their contribution to the city's aroma were just as generous. Dead animals weren't always removed immediately either. A rotting carcass could sit for hours, baking in the Mediterranean sun, before anyone dragged it away. The markets added their own distinctive perfume. Imagine fish stalls where yesterday's catch was still sitting out, mingling with the sharp tang of pickled olives, pungent cheeses, and spices. But the real kicker? Butchers often tossed animal guts into the gutter to be washed away by the next rain, and until then, the smell was so strong you could follow it from blocks away. Summer heat only made everything worse. Warm weather turned garbage heaps into fermentation pits, and without modern sanitation crews, the streets were rarely truly clean. Vendors tried to mask odors with incense or strong herbs, but those scents didn't cover the smell so much as mingle with it, creating an odd, choking blend of floral sweetness layered over sewage and decay. Even indoors, the air was far from fresh. In Insulae, the crowded apartment buildings where most Romans lived, cooking smoke, body odor, and the lingering stench of chamber pots all combined in the stairwells. Perfumed oils and garlands of flowers were common attempts to make life smell nicer, but they were just perfume over a compost pile. The smell of ancient Rome wasn't just one odor either. It was a symphony of stenches, constantly changing, but never truly gone. It was the background note to daily life. something every Roman got used to, but no modern nose could handle far more than a few minutes. For many Romans, the bathhouse wasn't just about getting clean. It was about being seen. The sprawling complexes were part spa, part gym, part social club, and also part business lounge. You could lift weights, play ball games, gossip with friends, strike up a business deal, and at some point, bathe. But let's set aside the marble elegance and get into the gritty reality. The water in the baths came from aqueducts, and it was certainly plentiful, but not necessarily fresh. The pools weren't drained and refilled after every visitor. In the busy public baths, the same water might be used for hours, even all day, by hundreds of people. Think about what that means. Skin flakes, sweat, hair, and whatever dirt or grime clung to your fellow bathers slowly blended in to a warm, human soup. The bathing process began with the apoditerium, the changing room. Here, you'd leave your clothes and hope the bathhouse attendant didn't steal them, because theft was really common. From there, you'd move into the tepidarium, a warm room to acclimate your body before entering the caldarium, a hot, steamy chamber where the real sweating happened. Sweat was actually part of the cleansing process, but it also meant the air was thick with the smell of bodies. Instead of soap, Romans used olive oil. You'd slather it on generously, loosening the dirt and sweat on your skin. Then scrape it all off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Imagine hundreds of people doing this, leaving behind heaps of oily, dirt-filled scrapings. Those scrapings had to go somewhere, and somewhere usually meant the floor, the drains, or buckets dumped outside later. The frigidarium, or cold plunge, came last, a bracing dip to close the pores. But by the time you got there, you were diving into water that dozens, if not hundreds, of people had already used that day. If someone had a skin infection, parasites, or an open wound, well, the baths didn't discriminate. Lice and fleas weren't killed by warm water alone, and intestinal parasites could survive a quick plunge. The air itself carried a cocktail of smells: hot, wet stone, perfumed oils, sweat, and the faintly rancid undertone of reused water. Bathhouse attendants sometimes sprinkled herbs or incense in the rooms to mask odors, but like the streets of Rome, the cover-up was more of a blend than an eraser. Despite the grime, bathhouses were addictive. For a few coins, you got warmth, conversation, and a sense of luxury. And for most Romans, that was worth sharing water with a few hundred strangers and whatever they brought with them. In a city with over 1 million people, when nature called, most Romans didn't answer it in private. Unless you were wealthy enough to have your own latrine at home, you'd head to one of the foracae, public toilets that were as much of a social space as a necessity. Picture a long stone or marble bench, cool to the touch, with evenly spaced keyhole-shaped openings cut into it. No stalls, no doors, just a row of strangers, and sometimes friends, sitting side by side, chatting, gossiping, or conducting business while doing their business. Conversation wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Roman writers even joked about making small talk in the latrine, as if it were the forum. Beneath the seats ran a continuous flow of water, part of the city sewer system, meant to carry away waste. In theory, this helped with cleanliness. In reality, sewers backed up, especially during heavy rains, sending odors, and sometimes worse, right back up to the latrine. Rome's great sewer could carry waste to the Tiber, but it didn't make the toilet smell any sweeter. And then there was the matter of wiping. Toilet paper didn't exist, so Romans used the infamous pterosorium, a sea sponge tied to the end of a wooden stick. After use, it was rinsed in a bucket or trough of water, often mixed with vinegar or salt for disinfection. That same sponge on a stick was shared by everyone in the latrine. No personal sponges, no disposable anything, just one communal cleaning tool going from hand to hand, person to person. The smell inside was a blend of ammonia from urine, the pungent rot of human waste, damp stone, and whatever was drifting up from the sewers. Add the heat of the summer, the lack of ventilation, and the occasional rat or insect scurrying by, and you have an environment that tested even the hardest Roman nose. So latrines were elaborately decorated, with mosaic floors and painted walls, proof that the Romans saw them as a civic amenity. But beauty didn't cancel out the reality. You were sitting in a room full of open waste pits, listening to the splash and gurgle beneath you, while trying not to breathe too deeply. But still, these public toilets were an important part of Roman life, not just for hygiene, but for social connection. It was a place where you could catch up on news, make deals, or trade gossip, all while sharing a sponge that had already been, let's just say, very well traveled. If you wandered into a Roman marketplace, the Macellum, your first impression would probably be one of abundance. Rows of stalls offering everything from fresh bread and olives to exotic spices from India and silk from China. The colors were dazzling, the variety impressive. But take a deep breath, and you'd quickly realize that the smells told a different story. Fresh meat was sold in the open air, often hanging from hooks, sometimes still dripping. Without refrigeration, there was a race against time. Meat butchered in the morning could already be turning by afternoon, especially in the summer heat. To mask the smell of spoilage, merchants doused their goods in strong spices or sauces, hoping customers would focus on the flavor rather than the freshness. One of the most common condiments was garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans put on, well, everything. Meat, vegetables, even fruit. Making garum involved leaving fish guts, blood, and sometimes whole small fish to sit in the sun for weeks until they broke down into a salty, pungent liquid. To modern noses, it would have been overpowering, but to Romans, it was as essential as ketchup or soy sauce is today. Its smell was so strong that entire coastal towns devoted to garum production were infamous for their reek. Fishmongers' stall had their own challenges. Some sold today's catch, others sold yesterday's, or the day before's, which had been salted or smoked to keep it, well, edible. Still, salted fish could develop a musty, oily odor after a few days, and piles of discarded fish heads and guts near the stalls would attract swarms of flies. Fruit and vegetable sellers provided a more pleasant note to the marketplace, but even here, things could turn. Bruised or overripe produce was often sold cheaply, and the smell of fermenting figs or squished grapes, mixed with the sharper tang of onions and garlic, didn't create quite a pleasing smell. Bakers added the warm, toasty scent of fresh bread, though many loaves were baked in communal ovens, where soot from the fire clung to the crust. Dining at home or in a tavern didn't guarantee freshness either. Street food vendors sold quick bites like sausages, lentil stews, or dried fish, but these were often reheated multiple times throughout a day. Wealthier Romans might enjoy elaborate feasts with exotic ingredients: flamingo tongues, stuffed dormice, peacock. But the more exotic the meat, the longer it had likely traveled, and the more creative the cooks had to be in disguising any questionable aroma. For the average Roman, taste was often about masking flaws rather than highlighting freshness. Strong wine, liberal use of vinegar, and heavy seasoning weren't just about culinary tradition. They were a survival tactic in a world where refrigeration was still 1,800 years away. Eating in Rome could be a delight for the senses, or a test of your stomach's courage, sometimes both at the same time. If you were lucky or well-connected enough to score an invitation to a wealthy Roman's dinner party, you might expect elegance, refinement, and the height of culinary sophistication. And at first glance, you'd be right. The dining room was decorated with fine mosaics, the couches draped in embroidered fabrics, the air perfumed with incense. Musicians played softly in the background, servants bustled around, bringing silver platters piled high with delicacies. But beneath all that luxury was a layer of mess. Roman banquets were often exercises in showing off wealth through extravagance, and part of that meant serving food that was unusual, rare, or shockingly expensive. Flamingo tongues, roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached for presentation, jellyfish salads, and dormice stuffed with minced pork and pine nuts all made appearances. Some recipes, preserved in cookbooks, included ingredients like so's womb, boiled in milk and seasoned with honey, or a sauce made of fermented fish guts, poured over nearly everything. The food wasn't served all at once. It came in courses, often lasting for hours. Between dishes, guests would sip sweetened wine with honey or spiced with pepper, but that wine was rarely pure, watered down, sometimes with a touch of seawater for flavor. It could carry a faintly briny taste that lingered throughout the night. As for table manners, forget the modern idea of neat plates and discreet eating. Romans dined on reclining couches, leaning on their left elbow, while servants brought food to them or placed it on low tables. They ate with their hands, and when they were done with bones, shells, or fruit pits, they simply tossed them on the floor. By the end of the evening, the floor would be a carpet of discarded food scraps, spilled wine, and greasy napkins. And then there was the matter of overindulgence. Roman writers tell us that at some feasts, guests would eat until they couldn't anymore, then excuse themselves to vomit, often in special vomiting rooms, or even in portable bowls, so that they could return to the table and keep going. Not every banquet went to that extreme, but the fact that the practice existed says a lot about how excess was valued. The smells in a triclinium were a mix of roasted meats, perfume, wine, sweat from the crowded room, and the occasional tang of garum drifting over the entire feast. Add the warmth of oil lamps and bodies packed together, and the air could get heavy and slightly sour as the night wore on. Servants scurried through the doors, through the chaos, stepping over piles of discarded food while refilling cups and replacing dishes. To an outsider, these elite parties were a strange contradiction. They were meant to be a showcase of culture, wealth, and refinement, yet the reality was noisy, messy, and sometimes downright unsanitary. Beneath the silver platters and peacock feathers was a feast that was as much about flaunting status as it was just about enjoying the food. And as the scraps rotted on the floor, the real aroma of Roman high society began to set in. After a long day, or a long night of overindulgence, Romans retreated to their sleeping quarters. For the wealthy, this meant a bedroom with painted walls, polished floors, and a bed frame made of wood or metal. For the poor, it was often just a corner of a cramped apartment inside a multi-story tenement building where entire families and sometimes livestock shared the same space. Beds themselves weren't exactly havens of comfort. A typical mattress might be stuffed with straw, reeds, or wool. Wealthier Romans could afford feathers, which were softer, but also excellent hiding place for pests. Bedbugs thrived in the seams. Fleas jumped freely from bedding to skin, and lice, it took up residence not just on your head, but in the fibers of blankets and pillows. In crowded insulae, the situation was even worse. Thin walls meant you heard your neighbors cough, snore, or argue throughout the night. And the shared infestation of vermin meant that no matter how often you shook out your bedding, you were never truly alone. Rats were a common nighttime companion too, scurrying across floors or rafters in search of crumbs left from supper. In poorer districts, rats could even gnaw through storage jars to get at grain or dried fruit, leaving behind droppings as an unwanted gift. The air in sleeping quarters could be stifling. In the summer, without proper ventilation, heat lingered well into the night. And in the winter, small braziers burned charcoal for warmth. But these gave off fumes, and if you fell asleep without good airflow, you risked carbon monoxide poisoning. The smell was a mix of stale sweat, unwashed clothes, and the faint must of a damp bedding that never quite dried in Rome's humid months. For the wealthy, the pest problem wasn't entirely avoided either. Even in elegant villas, warm rooms and imported bedding provided just as inviting a habitat for bugs, sometimes even more so. Servants were tasked with shaking out mattresses and bedding daily, but the effectiveness of this was questionable. Ancient texts even mention remedies for bed bugs and fleas, from burning herbs to smearing beds with resin, suggesting these little roommates were a problem for everyone. So whether you were sleeping under a painted ceiling in a luxurious villa or curled up on a straw pallet in a noisy apartment block, the Roman night was rarely silent, truly dark, or entirely free of creatures that saw you as their midnight feast. After a night like that, you might wake up feeling groggy, itchy, and ready for a fresh start to the day. But in ancient Rome, fresh was a very relative concept. Morning meant getting on with the daily chores, and some of those chores were stranger and smellier than you might imagine. Take laundry, for example. There was no washing machines, no fragrant detergents, no fabric softener commercials with people frolicking in meadows. Instead, Romans cleaned their clothes with, well, urine. Yeah, that urine. Collected from public urinals placed around the cities. Fullers, the professional launderers of Rome, prized it because urine contains ammonia, which is excellent for loosening dirt, grease, and stains. The process went like this. First, the clothes were soaked in vats of stale urine. Then, workers would climb in and stomp on them, barefoot, churning them in the pungent mix like grapes in a wine press. After that, the garments were rinsed in water, sometimes perfumed with herbs, if you were lucky, then beaten or wrung out before being hung to dry. It got the job done, but it meant that the freshly washed tunic you put on Monday morning probably carried a faint tang that no amount of sunshine could erase. And laundry was just one of many odd tasks that kept Rome running, chores that remind us that life in ancient worlds was both ingenious and often a little bit disgusting. While stomping clothes in urine was one of the more notorious Roman cleaning methods, it wasn't the only chore on the ancient to-do list. Romans had a knack for using whatever was available, no matter how strange, to solve everyday problems. Laundry wasn't the only place ammonia was put to work. Some Romans also used urine for dental hygiene. Yeah, certain cosmetic recipes recommended rinsing the mouth with Portuguese urine, which was considered to be especially potent to, you guys, whiten your teeth. The ammonia would, in theory, remove stains. Whether it worked out or not, the experience must have been unforgettable for both the user and anyone they spoke to afterward. Roman streets and courtyards were swept regularly, but in poorer neighborhoods, sweeping often just meant pushing debris into the nearest gutter or drain. Public spaces were sometimes cleaned with brooms made of twigs bound together, while floors in homes could be scrubbed with vinegar or lye made from wood ash. The vinegar helped cut through grime, and it also left a tangy scent that mixed wonderfully with the smell of chamber pots. Oil lamps were the main source of light after sunset, and they smoked constantly. Part of the daily routine was trimming the charred wicks and cleaning the sooty lamp bowls. Some households did this by blowing directly into the spout to loosen the soot, which meant a mouthful of fine, oily carbon dust, a hazard both to lungs and your dignity. Preparing meals also came with some unpleasant chores. Fuel was needed for ovens and stoves, and while wood was ideal, it could be incredibly expensive. Poorer Romans sometimes burned whatever was available: brushwood, dried weeds, and even dried animal dung. This gave food an earthy flavor no amount of garum could cover up. If you didn't live near a public latrine, emptying the household chamber pot was a daily, often unpleasant chore. Waste was either taken to a cesspit, dumped into a gutter, or, against the law but still common, thrown out into the street. Some unlucky members of the household became the designated pot boy, responsible for lugging the sloshing container outside each morning. Even though Rome had aqueducts, many people didn't have running water in their homes. Someone had to walk to the nearest public fountain or well, fill heavy clay jars, and haul them back. This was often the job of slaves, servants, or the lower-ranking members of the household. In summer, it was hot, exhausting work, and the water didn't always stay clean on the trip home. In short, daily chores in ancient Rome were inventive, practical, and often unpleasant. They remind us that behind the marble statues and grand forums, real people were busy scrubbing, hauling, enduring smells and tasks that modern life has spared most of us, thankfully. And as strange as some of these daily chores sound, they were nothing compared to what Romans did when they got sick. You might think a civilization with aqueducts, heated floors, and concrete would have an equally advanced medical science. But while Roman doctors were skilled in surgery and anatomy, their cures could be creative. If you had a headache, for example, you might be told to wear a poultice of mashed camel brains on your forehead. A sore throat? Try gargling with vinegar and crushed snail shells. Constipation? A dose of animal dung mixed with wine was thought to reset the body. And those were the treatments prescribed by professionals. The home remedies could be even wilder. Medicine in ancient Rome was a strange mix of genuine medical knowledge, superstition, and sheer trial and error. While Roman physicians could perform complex surgeries and understood the basics of hygiene in certain contexts, many everyday remedies belong more to the realm of magical thinking than actual modern science, and they could be downright revolting. Suffering from a pounding headache? A physician might prescribe a poultice made from boiled camel brains smeared directly onto your forehead. The idea was that the cooling quality of the brains would draw out the heat and the pressure. Whether it worked or not, you'd be left with a sticky, slowly spoiling compress that made you smell like a desert stable. Dung was a surprisingly common ingredient in Roman medicine. Mixed with honey, goat dung was applied to wounds to draw out infection. Pig dung, dried and powdered, was sometimes used to treat nosebleeds. There were even recipes for consuming animal dung, diluted in wine or vinegar for digestive troubles. The theory was that the earthy fermented matter could rebalance the stomach. The reality? Probably just more stomach troubles. Ashes from burnt animal bones were believed to have healing properties, especially for skin conditions. They might be mixed with animal fat to make a paste for sores or rashes. Gladiators' blood was also prized as a cure for epilepsy, consumed fresh after the games by desperate spectators who believed they were absorbing the warrior's strength. Some cures bordered on ritual magic. For toothaches, one recipe suggested catching a live weasel, whispering your complaint into its ear, and releasing it, supposedly transferring your pain to the animal. Another remedy for persistent coughs involved roasting a mouse, grinding it into powder, and mixing it into honey before consuming. Romans also believed in preventative charms. Wearing a piece of snakeskin around your waist could supposedly ward off fevers, while swallowing a small live spider wrapped in butter, yeah really, was thought to prevent illness entirely. To be fair, not every Roman cure was bizarre. They used herbs like garlic, fennel, and mint for digestion, poppy for pain relief, and willow bark, which actually contains salicin, a natural source of aspirin. But these reasonable remedies were often served alongside the more questionable ones, meaning your treatment plan could be equal parts herbal tea and roasted mouse. For the average Roman, being ill wasn't just uncomfortable. It could mean enduring strange smells, odd textures, and the lingering taste of whatever your doctor, or your neighbor, thought might cure you. Whether you survived the ailment was often less about the treatment and more just about sheer luck. After all that, the strange smells, the stomach-turning cures, and the daily grime, you might wonder how Romans tried to present themselves to the world, because even in a city full of chamber pots, street muck, and camel-brain poultices, appearances still mattered. Clothing in ancient Rome wasn't just about staying warm or covered. It was about telling everyone exactly who you were, your place in society, and sometimes even what you'd been up to that day. From the pristine white toga of a senator to the work-stained tunic of a laborer, your outfit spoke volumes before you ever opened your mouth. Clothing in ancient Rome was as much a social signal as it was a necessity. Your outfit could tell strangers your gender, citizenship status, wealth, and even your moral standing. But behind the graceful drapes of the toga and the bright colors of the tunica were itchy fibers, hard labor, and some surprising sources for those rich dyes. For most Romans, daily clothing was simple: a woolen tunica, essentially a long, belted shirt. Men's tunics usually reached the knees. Women's were ankle length and often worn with a belt just under the bust. Wool was the default fabric, but in warmer climates, or for the wealthy, linen was preferred. Unfortunately, ancient wool wasn't as soft as today's. It would be scratchy, heavy, and hot in summer, especially if it hadn't been washed well. Remember, that meant urine cleaning. The toga was the quintessential Roman garment for male citizens. It was a massive semicircular piece of wool, up to 18 feet wide, draped in a very specific way over one shoulder. Wearing it properly required practice, and often the help of a slave or servant, and keeping it in place meant moving carefully all day. The pristine white toga worn by political candidates was treated with chalk to make it glow, but that chalk could rub off onto your skin, leaving your arms and tunic looking dusty. In hot weather, the toga was stifling. In the rain, it soaked up water like a sponge. Respectable women wore stola, a long, sleeveless overdress over their tunic, often with a flowing shawl called a palla. These garments could be decorated with colorful borders or embroidery, but luxury came at a cost. Fine fabrics like silk were imported from China, and bright dyes were expensive. The most prized of all was purple. It was extracted from murex sea snails. Making just a small amount of this dye meant crushing thousands of snails, letting them rot slightly, and then boiling them, a process that produced a rich color and an unforgettable foul smell during production. Footwear ranged from simple leather sandals to sturdy boots worn by soldiers. Shoes weren't always fitted to the left or the right foot. Many were symmetrical, and padding was minimal, meaning long walks on Roman roads could leave feet sore and blistered. For indoor gear, some people went barefoot, which also meant a greater chance of stepping into whatever the streets had to offer. Since laundry involved ammonia-rich urine, freshly cleaned clothes might carry a faint tang even after rinsing. Wealthy Romans masked this with perfumes or scented oils, rubbing them onto both skin and fabric. But perfume was expensive, so for the average person, clean might just mean less dirty than yesterday's. And while the wealthy could afford vibrant colors, soft fabrics, and elaborate tailoring, comfort wasn't always the priority. Heavy garments, hot weather, and the constant dust of the streets meant even the most elegant outfit could feel sweaty and grimy by midday. For the working poor, a tunic patched and faded from years of wear was more practical than stylish, and in some jobs, like laboring in a tannery or fullery, clothing was as much a protective layer as it was a statement. In short, Roman clothing projected an image of order, civilization, and wealth, but living in it meant dealing with heat, itchiness, smells, and the occasional snail-based fashion statement. Of course, in Rome, the outfit was only half the presentation. Once you had your tunic belted or your toga draped just right, it was time to focus on your hair. Because in a society obsessed with appearances, your head was prime real estate for fashion. And just like their clothing, Roman hairstyles were statements of identity. and status, from towering, intricate curls that needed a small army of hairdressers to keep in place, to wigs made from the hair of enslaved people or even captured enemies. Hair was as much a display of power as it was a personal choice. But as we'll see, keeping up with Roman beauty standards could just be as uncomfortable, smelly, and strange as everything else in their daily life. If clothing announced your social status, hair was the finishing touch, and in ancient Rome, it was rarely left to chance. Hairstyles shifted with the trends, which could change as quickly as the whims of emperors and empresses, and maintaining the right look often meant hours of work, strange ingredients, and occasionally a smell you'd rather not carry around. For elite Roman women, hair was a canvas for extravagance. The simplest style was a loose bun at the back of the head, but fashion in the imperial era took things to dizzying heights, literally. Intricate arrangements of braids, ringlets, and curls could rise several inches above the head, supported by pins, combs, and even wireframes hidden in the hair. These elaborate constructions required the skills of a personal hairdresser who might spend hours shaping and securing every strand. But perfect curls didn't come naturally. Women often used heated metal rods, the ancient curling iron, to get tight spirals, a process that could easily scorch hair or your scalp. Blonde hair was considered especially fashionable, so some women bleached theirs with a mixture of vinegar and powdered pumice, or simply wore wigs imported from Germany, often made from the hair of enslaved women taken in war. These wigs were expensive, but prized for their thickness and natural light color. Roman men, on the other hand, favored shorter styles, especially during the Republic, when neatly trimmed hair and clean-shaven faces were associated with discipline and refinement. The so-called Caesar cut, short all around with a fringe combed forward, was popular among the elite. In the imperial era, beards occasionally came into fashion, especially under philosophers. Men's hair was often oiled and combed daily, and some dyed it to hide gray or to match fashionable shades. Unfortunately, Roman hair dye recipes could be harsh. One common black dye used a mixture of lead and vinegar, which worked, at the cost of slowly poisoning the user. Shaving was an art. Razors were small, curved blades that required a steady hand. Barbers were everywhere, offering shaves, haircuts, and gossip in equal measure. But without modern safety razors, nicks and cuts were common, and infections weren't far behind. Some men used pumice stone to smooth the skin after shaving, leaving it red and raw. For body hair, women sometimes plucked it with tweezers or singed it off with a small flame. Wealthy Romans could afford certain creams, but these often contained quicklime or arsenic, making smooth skin come at a painful and potentially deadly price. Both men and women used scented oils to keep their hair shiny and cover less pleasant odors from the city air. These perfumes could be made from flowers, herbs, or exotic imports, but the oil base sometimes went rancid in the heat, turning a sweet smell sour. In short, Roman grooming was a constant balancing act between beauty and discomfort. A well-kept head of hair could signal wealth, power, and sophistication, but it also required time, money, and a tolerance for burns, bad smells, and the occasional brush with toxic chemicals. Once the hair was curled, pinned, oiled, and hopefully not still smelling faintly of vinegar or singed ends, it was time to show it off, because in Rome, looking your best wasn't just for your own satisfaction, it was for public display. And there were plenty of places to be seen, from the roaring crowds of the Colosseum to the chariot races at the Circus Maximus, from bustling bathhouses to lively dinner parties. Leisure in ancient Rome was as much about spectacle as it was about relaxation. But as with everything else in the city, the fun came with its own set of strange, messy, and occasionally dangerous realities. So let's talk about leisure and entertainment in ancient Rome. For all of their hard work and hard smells, Romans knew how to have fun. Leisure was an essential part of public life, especially for those who wanted to display their wealth, status, or political influence. But like everything in Rome, even the most glamorous pastimes had a messy, sometimes downright gruesome underside. Take the Colosseum, for instance. It was the ultimate stage for Roman entertainment. Tens of thousands packed into the stands to watch gladiators combat, wild animal hunts, and mock naval battles. The roar of the crowd, the glint of sunlight on armor, and the grand scale of the arena created an intoxicating spectacle. But the reality was brutal. The sand in the arena floor wasn't just there for traction. It soaked up blood, sweat, and whatever else spilled during combat. Between matches, workers raked and replaced the top layer, but the underlying stench of dried blood and decaying flesh, it lingered. On hot days, the odor would waft up into the stands, mixing with the smell of packed humanity, cheap wine, and fried street food sold by vendors. And for the unlucky spectators seated close to the action, there was always the risk of being sprayed with, well, let's just say it wasn't water. At the Circus Maximus, the chariot races were as thrilling as any modern motorsport, and just as dangerous. Teams of horses thundered around the track, drivers leaning into the turns at breakneck speeds, their tunics wrapped tightly around their bodies to prevent snagging. Crashes, or shipwrecks, were common, sending charioteers and horses tumbling into the splinters and dust. The atmosphere was crazy. Fans wore team colors, red, white, blue, or green, and sometimes brawled in the stands over their favorites. The noise of hooves, wheels, shouting, and the blast of horns filled the air, along with the less glamorous smell of horse sweat, manure, and the occasional accident on the track. And while we've already peeked at Roman bathhouses from a hygiene angle, they were also a prime venue for leisure. People didn't just bathe, they exercised, played games, listened to music, discussed politics, and struck business deals. Bathhouses were noisy, busy, and often crowded, with people from all walks of life. But the reality of public bathing was less than ideal. Water was reused throughout the day, oil scraped from bodies floated in the pools, and the humid air could carry the smell of sweat, perfumes, and wet stone. Still, for many Romans, the bathhouse was the beating heart of social life, a place to see and be seen, no matter what might be lurking in the water. Now, entertainment wasn't just confined to big venues. Streets were alive with acrobats, musicians, jugglers, and fortune tellers. During public festivals, the city erupted into feasts and games, sometimes with free bread and wine distributed by politicians eager to win public favor. These gatherings could be joyous, but they could also be chaotic, with crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, refuse piling in the streets, and drunken revelers turning the celebrations into all-night parties. For Romans, leisure was never just a relaxation. It was spectacle, status, and a chance to immerse yourself in the shared life of the city. But behind the grandeur, the sweat, grime, and occasional blood were always part of the show. But no matter how grand the games, how crazy the races, or how luxurious the baths, life in ancient Rome always marched toward the same destination, death. And in a city as crowded, chaotic, and ritual-driven as Rome, even dying and what happened afterward was surrounded by strict customs, symbolic gestures, and sometimes a few unsettling realities. Because for the Romans, death wasn't the end of your public image. The way you were buried, the ceremonies performed, and even the location of your final resting place were just as telling as the clothes you wore or the home you lived in. And as we'll see, the journey from last breath to burial could be surprisingly elaborate, and occasionally unpleasant. Death in ancient Rome was as public and performative as life itself. When someone passed on, the process of mourning began almost immediately. Family members would close the deceased's eyes, wash the body, and dress it in fine clothing. A coin was often placed in the mouth, payment for Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld. For the wealthy, funerals could be grand affairs. Professional mourners were hired to wail loudly in the streets, while musicians played sad tunes. Sometimes actors were brought in to wear wax masks of the family's ancestors, parading through the city to remind onlookers of the deceased noble's lineage. The body might be carried on a decorated bier, surrounded by flowers, incense, and the persistent hum of flies drawn to the summer heat. But Rome had strict rules. Burials and cremations had to take place outside the city walls to avoid disease and bad omen. The roads leading out of Rome were lined with tombs and monuments, part graveyard, part eternal display of wealth. Some were elaborate marble structures, others simple stone markers, but all were meant to be seen by passerby, ensuring that even in death, the Romans remained part of the public eye. Cremation was the most common practice in the Republic and early empire. Bodies were placed on a funeral pyre, sometimes with personal belongings or sacrifices. The smell of burning flesh mixed with wood smoke could drift for miles, a stark reminder of mortality. Later, burial became more popular, especially among Christians, and grave goods, jewelry, coins, even food were placed alongside the body for use in the afterlife. So when we peel back the marble facades, the towering monuments, and the heroic statues, Rome reveals itself as a city both magnificent and messy, a place where beauty and filth, elegance and odor, life and death, all existed, side by side. Its citizens dined on exotic delicacies while tossing scraps to the floor, washed their clothes in urine before draping themselves in snail-dyed silks, styled their hair with curling irons hot enough to scorch, and gathered in arenas where the air was thick with the scent of sweat and blood. Even in death, they staged one last performance, ensuring their memory and their smell lingered just a little bit longer. Ancient Rome wasn't just the seat of an empire. It was a living, breathing organism, pulsing with noise, color, and scent. And while history often remembers the grandeur, it's in the grit that we find the real Rome, not just the Rome of emperors and marble, but of everyday people navigating the glorious, grimly reality of daily life. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. And for those of you still awake, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping the crackling embers will put you to sleep. Until next time, see you later.